previously in episode 1.
In some ways, in the midst of all of that, I was living my best life. I am feeling the hugs of a third grade teacher.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Boosie Teaches podcast. As we say here at Boosie Teaches, in a galaxy of learners, Boosie Teaches lights the way. As our host Tanya Busico says to her students, come on in, relax, we'll be here a while. Let's get started.
Hello, welcome to episode 2. If you haven't already, please check out episode 1, but can you believe we're already at our second episode? Episode 2, Recovering Confidence and Difficult Truth-Telling with Dr. Katherine Clay Bassard. We taped our episode April 2021. I hope you enjoy. Hey everyone, I'm Tanya Busico and I teach writing, communication, and a few other skills to first-year college students. Welcome to the Boosie Teaches podcast. As I tell my students, come on in, relax, we'll be here a while. Let's get started. So this first season is all about mentors and influential people in my life. These are people that I'm certain you should know their stories too. So while they're the most successful people I know, they're also the most generous. And today we have Dr. Katherine Clay Bassard, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. She has published 2 books, over a dozen articles, and delivered numerous invited lectures and keynote addresses. She is the recipient of the Distinguished Scholar Award at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. She's also taught courses in African American literature and culture at the University of California, Berkeley, and Virginia Commonwealth University. A highlight for her as a teacher upon the death of the Nobel Prize laureate Toni Morrison in 2019 was hearing from students who thanked her for introducing them to her novels. But let me tell you how I met Dr. Bassard. She was my professor at VCU when I was working on my MFA in theater, and I took her class, Slavery in the African American Literary Imagination, in 2014. I can't believe it's been so long. But I actually heard about Dr. Bassard from my advisor, Dr. Noreen Barnes, in the theater department. And as a Black woman student, it is so important to me to be able to see and learn from educators that look like me. And I remember in the class just having my eyes open, and we read familiar slave narratives such as Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass, but this class was a little bit different because it really helped me to think about the structure of slave narratives, to also think about the deeper meanings, but also the linkage between the narratives and spirituality, which was something important to me. And I also remember learning more about Black people who enslaved other Black people in America. And I was familiar with the concept after watching the episode on A Different World when Whitley Gilbert finds out her family's history. Reading The Known World by Edward P. Jones really helped me think about that concept, very complicated concept, in a different way. I also want to say that Dr. Bassard was a model for me for Black women professors. I remember how things in our class weren't sugar-coated, which was surprising to me because our class was not majority Black. And I didn't even know how we would navigate a class like that with, there were only 2 Black women in our class, and actually my friend Janelle, which we became friends later on. And I just remember Dr. Bassard being so encouraging yet firm and making the class very exciting and really wanting us to, or helping us to really see the complexity of what it meant to be formerly enslaved. The class really helped me create a new hero's journey. And so it was this idea that people who look like me, my ancestors, could have such a liberating story, even in the circumstances. So let's get started, and we're going to have a conversation. So my first question to you is, how are you?
I am doing well, Tanya. Thank you so much for inviting me. That was quite an introduction. I'm really touched by it.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about you as a student, whether secondary or college or both. What kind of student were you?
I was inquisitive. I read all the time, just loved books, always had my nose in a book. I did great all the way through high school, won all the honors, scored higher on the SAT, all of that. When I hit undergraduate, though, I went to a predominantly white institution, to Wake Forest University in the South, in North Carolina, in the late 70s, early 80s. And that was like a brick wall for me, because all of a sudden, first of all, I was around people of tremendous wealth.
Right.
We other students on my hall who had people who looked like me that were unpacking for them and chauffeuring them about it. And so I'd never seen that level of wealth before. And we were just such a severe minority presence on campus. I think the number of Black students who were not athletes of some sort, I could count on the fingers of my hand.
Wow.
So we kind of stayed close together, but it was tough. It was actually really, really tough. I think back, and my confidence slipped a lot. A lot of my early adulthood was about recovering that confidence. The bright spot, though, was a woman named Dolly McPherson, who was the one Black professor in the English department who dared to teach a course in African American literature, the first one in the history of Wake Forest at the time.
Wow.
And we read James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright and Toni Morrison. The first time I read Toni Morrison, we read Song of Solomon. And that class and Dr. McPherson herself, it was just life-changing. And it became kind of an anchor to hold on to that kept me grounded and allowed me to finish. And of course, I declared an English major.
Wow, that is so interesting, particularly because I had a similar story going to William and Mary undergrad, to say the least. And I love how you talked about just the rebuilding your confidence, because I think that we don't spend enough time, particularly when we mentor or talk to young Black women, to say like being in these spaces do affect our confidence. So thank you for that. So let's talk a little bit about genius or purpose. What would you say is your genius or purpose?
I think I've had the time to think about this. I think what you alluded to earlier, for some reason, I have a gift for talking about really tough things.
Yeah.
And for leading people into conversations where they'd rather not be, looking at material and realities that we'd rather not face, and to trying to give voice to really, really tough subjects. And you mentioned the slave narratives, and I think people might think about Frederick Douglass's narrative and think of slave narratives as triumphant, or something like that. But I mean, from studying the genre, I mean, those narratives are filled with just brutality and cruelty and just such senseless disregard for the humanity of people who look like you and me. I mean, and it's really tough. It's tough for all of us to look at it. It's tough for majority students to look at it. I think it's particularly hard for those of us who are Black, because we understand that had we been born in that time, even with all the gifts and talents and capabilities we have right now, we would have been them.
Right.
And we see ourselves in it in a different way, and it's hard. So I feel like I've been given almost kind of a ministry of helping people face pain and trauma, look at it through the just gifted writers who gave voice to it, both in the 19th century and even now. You mentioned Edward P. Jones, for example. Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad is another just courageous text. And then daring us to give some kind of voice to it ourselves, because until we can speak it and not be damaged by the speaking, we can't heal from it.
Right. Wow, that's powerful. So pushing a little bit further, how did you know that this was your gift or purpose?
I don't know. I think I just always was in situations where I was the truth teller. I was the truth teller family. I come from a very religious family. That's their way of having to navigate Jim Crow and all of the atrocities that went before Jim Crow. I myself am a person of deep faith and spirituality, but I was always the one that would tell the truth when everybody else was sugarcoating stuff or,
Right.
giving it like, no, that's not what happened. This is what happened. It didn't always go well when I was little, but I just always felt compelled to tell the truth about a situation, no matter how much we wanted to look away.
Right.
So that's my role, I think, in life.
Wow, that's powerful. Particularly in education, to be able to tell the truth at a time where everything feels so political. And is political, but the reality is that we're talking about people's lives and people's experiences. So let's talk a little bit more about how was it confirmed? So you know what it is, you discovered it, but how was it confirmed? How did you know, like, okay, this is confirmation that this is what I'm supposed to do or who I am?
I think the confirmation was seeing the results of it, particularly in my students. You're a prime example. I'm so proud of you for doing these podcasts and
Thank you.
for everything that you're doing. And just to see the effects on people, that people weren't destroyed by talking about difficult truths. Not everybody is on the same place in the journey with things, but you would see people really transformed by the information and able to say, okay, I can face this trauma and I can make something of it and I can, incorporate it into my life as I need to, and I can move on. But every time I hear from students, the things they're doing just is so exciting. Just having people, even on student evaluations at the end of class, saying, this was the most eye-opening class I've ever had. I learned so much, transformative. I mean, that's where the proof really is.
Right. And I don't know because when I graduated and then I came back to teach, you were in a different position, but I don't know if I ever told you that because of that class, I actually started a writing class for a little bit at Virginia Union School of Theology based on that genre. And so what I did was I had students talk about like their call story to ministry, but we really looked at the structure of slave narratives, and it really, I'm getting chills thinking about this, but it really, as we say in the church, set people free, but really thinking about healing, to talk about some very difficult experiences. And this was the first time that people who were much older than I were able to say, this traumatic thing happened to me, and really began to process it on their own healing journey. And so to your point with confirmation, it definitely went beyond, our class. And I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about teaching. So when someone says teaching, what does that mean to you?
I love teaching. I really do. As an administrator, I don't get to teach as much, which is sad for me sometimes. But what I love about it, teaching for me is mostly just about having conversations,
Right.
and especially as a literature professor, some great books, some great writers, and let's talk about them and let's see how we read them, but also how the books read us, and how these writers give us things that help us examine ourselves differently. I like to talk anyway. I feel completely blessed that I found a profession where I get paid for doing what I would do anyway, talking about Langston Hughes or talking about Toni Morrison or talking about Alice Walker. I think that's just tremendous. But I've never seen teaching as a hierarchical thing. I've never seen it as being about me, imparting information. Although, one of the great things about a PhD, you learn a lot. You have all the stuff you want to tell the world, but also learning from my students and having students teach each other as well. So there's several dynamics going on to me in a successful classroom. The professor or the teacher is imparting knowledge that by benefit of our experience and our reading and our degrees we have and that we want to gift to our students, but also of watching for those moments where we learn something in return that we didn't know before. And also watching students engage and teach each other.
Yes, absolutely. because I definitely remember our presentations, but your class is a little bit different because, and I didn't know at the time that PhD level work, you would just we teach each other all the time. And your class is one of the first times that we had to really give lessons, so to speak, and teach each other in a way where it wasn't just a traditional conversation. And I was glad to be able to get those skills. So let's talk a little bit about, actually, this isn't on the list, but I would love to know what made you decide to actually be a professor and not something else after you, I mean, because there's so many different academic careers.
What made me decide to be a professor? Um, it was, I always call myself kind of an accidental scholar. I didn't really have a plan. And I think that's typical of a lot of us who are first generation college students. I mean, we were thrown into an institution that we don't really understand, predominantly white institution, and you're one of a handful of minority students. It's more difficult. I maintain that Black students in white institutions suffer kind of institutional injury, right, that stays with us and that we have to kind of come out of. And I didn't really have a plan. I just wanted to finish. I came out under Ronald Reagan during the recession, so there were no jobs, so I had to wander around for a while, was in retail and all of that. And then I just, some kind of way, found myself on VCU campus and walked into the chair's office, and the man was telling me about that they have a master's in English. And I was interested in that. So my path was just about walking through the next open door. Not sure where it was or where it was going to come from. Okay, so that door opened, so I did that. And then people are like, well, what are you going to do after the master's degree? I stayed and taught as an instructor for a couple of years at VCU. And a friend of mine was talking to me about getting a PhD. I was actually embarrassed to say at that time, I didn't know what PhD stood for. There was Doctor of Philosophy. I know now, but I didn't know that because no one had taught me, right? So I applied to Rutgers and I got in. So I just was following these kind of paths. When I was teaching as an instructor at VCU, I absolutely fell in love with teaching. I knew that I wanted to teach on the college level. That's all I knew. I didn't know how I would get there. Went through the PhD and at Rutgers on the doctoral program. That's when I really understood that I had something to say as a scholar, that I actually had a point of view that no one else had, that I was reading text in different ways. I started wanting to be an English Renaissance, loved Renaissance poets, and I was going through the Rutgers Library to work on a paper on Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, which I just loved. Walked into the library, saw an entire wall of books on Spenser.
Wow.
And it was just really daunting, right? I'm on my way out of the library and I look and I see two little half-empty shelves of books with how those little metal fill the whole row. Each one had like a little metal bookend about half full. And I said, what is this? And I stooped down. That was the African American literature section.
Wow.
1980 something.
Wow.
And I was like, you know what? The world doesn't need another book on Spenser. This is where the work is. And I went in and walked into my professor's office, Dr. Cheryl Wall, who's no longer with us. And I said, you know what? I want to do my dissertation in African American literature. So that's how I ended up there. And I guess the rest is history.
Wow. It's those by chance moments. And it's so interesting you say that, because a lot of my mentors, first of all, I'm just loving this conversation, but I realized a lot of my mentors are first generation. And so the way that you crystallize this sense of if a door opens, I walk through it is so, I mean, it just, it's like such a crystallizing moment, because I recognized that even in how I'm crafting this podcast, that is so many people's stories. And that's so encouraging for students, because it helps us see that you don't have to have it all together. at, as a freshman. You don't have to say, I'm going to get a PhD my first year of college. And that, thank you for that. So let's talk a little bit about mentorship style. And so how would you say your mentorship style differs between students, faculty, and other administrators?
So I'm just blessed to mentor a lot of people. I think with students, the mentorship is much more formal in some ways because it tends to come out of a classroom experience
Right.
that just continues, after the students graduated, the student reaches back or something, and we start to set up connections that way. But I also minister, it was a Freudian slip, but mentor a lot of people, Black women who are in administrative positions or who are in the professorate, because there are still just far too few of us. And mainly it's just kind of setting up regular communication. A lot of that's been via Zoom right now. But just always being available. I like to let the mentee kind of set the pace of things. I don't sit down and hey, what's going on? But make sure that I have an open door, and communicate that, there's never a bad time. There's never a situation that's too difficult or too simple to talk about. So many things that are routine, I think, for our majority colleagues just aren't routine for us, what job to take, is this a fair contract I'm being offered, or am I being treated differently? I mean, all of those are questions that we have to ask, and we have to know that there's someone where it's safe to ask that.
Right. But I also want to think about your research and your experience with Black literature. How has that influenced, your style or view of mentorship with your research?
Oh, that's a really, really interesting question. And I'm just thinking in some ways about the content of the books I teach and what I work on. I think for me, it's helped me to appreciate connections, because certainly under chattel slavery, those connections were subject to being broken, a whim of a slaveholder to cover a gambling debt, or because somebody died, or, you could be separated from people that you cared about. And so because of that, connections were just so dear to Black people. You talked about, needing to see someone who looks like you, someone who understands. And I think during my research, I came to realize that helped Black people get through that experience and has continued to help us get through these experiences, and we're going through a pretty horrific moment now with, with police brutality, and, you might be stopped for a traffic violation, end up dead. We can't underestimate the profundity of the moment that we're in, and the devaluing of our very beings and our bodies and our lives. That what's gotten us through that, to my mind, is some kind of spiritual connection to something larger than ourselves. And some kind of long view that there's a purpose, that things will be better, that if I hold on and stay alive for the next generations who come behind me, that there will be a positive outcome. And also just, again, connecting with each other and having a person or a group of people that when everything's just going horribly, or you just, wake up that day and you've got imposter syndrome and you don't feel good about yourself and you don't think you'll ever make it, that there's somebody that can. I always talk about the friends I have who help put me back together, right? Because just going through life and working in these jobs and interacting with people pull us apart. We become undone a lot of times. You will sit in a meeting and hear something and it's just like, and we walk through those minefields literally on a daily basis. And I don't think our majority colleagues really can fully understand. But you've got to have the people who can put you back together. right? Who, when you get with them, and I have friends who aren't PhDs, right?
Right.
Didn't have the
Right.
benefits I had even to go to college, or already in fancy offices and things like that. But I get with them and we laugh and laugh, and I mean, until we're all just like aching, sides aching, you know what I'm saying? Our cheeks are hurting because we've laughed
Right.
so, and that puts me back together. It grounds me. It reminds me that as important as my job is, and as blessed as I am to have it, and as dedicated I am to it, it is not me.
Right.
It's me in the job for a reason, to bless other people. And it just restores all the things that had been taken away.
Mm. Wow, that is so important and that is so powerful. So let's talk about mentors. So you mentioned two people, but do you have any other mentors that have stood out to you?
Yeah, I talked about Dolly McPherson Chirwell, who was with me at Rutgers. There seems like there's always been someone when I needed somebody. It's just been my great fortune that when I was at a particular point in my career, there was this person who was
Right.
there, another Black woman who was like, you can do it, you can apply for this job, you can do this next thing. Wanda Mitchell at VCU, who's unfortunately also no longer with us, was that person. She was the diversity officer, vice president, when I was at VCU. She was like, you could be a provost, you can be a vice provost. I had never even thought about that before. So that's been great. Um, Val Smith, who's the president of Swarthmore College, who I met when I was at Berkeley and she was at UCLA years and years ago. And she's just always, and it's funny because we don't even talk that often because she's so busy as a college president. But it's like we'll get in touch right at the right moment, in these little nodal moments where I'm thinking of applying for a job, or something's changed, or what have you. All of a sudden she'll show up in my inbox, or I'll show up on hers. And she's just been a light. Somebody who, with all of her success, all of her accolades, has not changed one bit in all the time. I mean, in terms of her values, who she
Wow.
is, her groundedness, down to earth. I mean, that is what I aspire. I aspire to reach the heights, but not be so altered by the experience that I don't recognize myself, you know? And that takes all these things we're talking about. It takes mentorship, it takes seeing somebody else do it, it takes staying connected and grounded. And for me, the title's not worth it if you lose that stuff, you
Mm.
know. So she's been great, and she has just connected me with a group of African American presidents and provosts. So
Oh,
we went to our
great.
first meeting yesterday. It was so great to
Yes.
see us all on the Zoom call. I was like, oh, still a very few of us, but
Great.
just being in the same room and sharing, getting through COVID while Black, getting through COVID while Black and leading in a
Right.
college. So yeah, it's been great. So I'm excited about being connected with that group now.
Wow. That is, I love this question, not just because I made it, but it's so important to find out that your mentors are still being mentored. It's such a powerful continuum. And that's how I see my mentors. I see all of you all as like, we're interconnected in ways where you're a part of my story, I'm a part of your story, but how all of our stories continue. And that is, I'm so excited for you and what will come out of just connecting with people who have a shared experience. But let's talk a little bit about balance. So you talked about your friends that put you back together. But how else do you find balance, or do you have any self-care routines that you do just to restore yourself?
Mhm. Yeah, that's something I've had to learn from just hitting a wall and being just burned out several times in my life, just taking on way more than I should have, saying yes too many times or to everything, and not separating out what I should say yes to and what I should leave alone,
Right.
um, and not leaving enough time and room for me. It's gotten easier now that my husband and I are empty nesters now. We have two
Okay.
adult children. son is a rising senior in college. So
Congrats.
that has given me more space for this. I wasn't always a good practitioner of it, but I've just learned when I'm tired
Mm,
and when I'm exhausted. And I mean, this COVID year has been an exhausting year where it's
right.
been all hands on deck. So everybody's overworked, I think, right now. But I've just learned the signs of when I'm not functioning well or at my best. And the problem is if I don't stop and take a break at those moments, my decision making is going to be impaired, you know.
Right.
And I'm not going to be thinking things through. I'm just going to want to rush through it so I can be done. And when you're in a position where so much is at stake, you
Right.
know, you can't be, you can't do that. So I've just learned that even if someone furrows a brow or raises an eyebrow,
Mhm.
if I need to stop, if I need to take a mental health day, I'm just going to do it,
Mm,
and I always come back better and stronger and ready to go. And I think sometimes, especially when we're Black women in these jobs, we feel like we have to overperform, right?
yes.
And we feel like we can't be tired, we can't take a day off, we can't admit that that we need to sleep, for example.
Right.
uh, and that's just a mistake. I think the eye-opening thing for me, I would hear my coworkers talk about all these vacations. They were like, you know,
Yes.
you know what I'm saying? They're going to Europe. I was like, how are they
Yes.
vacations? And here I was still slogging away.
Yes.
Time at the provost office at VCU on a Friday afternoon. And it was really quiet. It suddenly hit me. I was the only one in the office.
Wow.
Everybody else had gone home. But I felt like, no, but I can't leave because what are people thinking of? So it's like other people are doing this, right? And we're not. And so what's the outcome going to be? And I've had lost too many friends in their 50s, I mean, way too early. Um, because we just felt like we couldn't take a break and we had to keep going.
Right.
And we neglected getting a screening or
Right.
going to the doctor. I mean,
Right.
something we just don't even do that sometimes.
Right.
So I'm a big proponent of rest. I'm blessed with being able usually to sleep 8 full hours. I lay
Right.
down, I go to sleep, I get up. It's a blessing. It is a true blessing. Um, I do exercise. I get on the treadmill in the morning before I come into work, clears my mind, have my praise music going, doing
Yes.
something for me spiritually,
Yes.
and you know, trying to do better with eating and all of that because what we do with our bodies now is going to determine our longevity,
Right.
our quality of life for years to come.
Right. But one thing that I did want to follow up on, because you talked about Black women feeling like we need to overproduce. Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, I mean, it comes from, well, the society has told us that, right? That
Right.
we have to be super qualified, whereas somebody else only needs to be a little bit qualified and they walk through the door, right? Because they're presumed qualified
Mhm.
by their race and their gender. We're presumed unqualified. So
Right.
we're always feeling like no matter what our PhD and what our credentials, we have to just keep going and we have to overdo. I mean, I think, and maybe I'm just coming to this now. I'm kind of in my early 60s, but just coming to this
Wow,
now
you
that,
look great. I had no idea.
oh, thank you. Well, I appreciate
Yes, I
that.
really don't try to presume people's age, but like you could, as people say down here, you could buy me with a penny because wow, you look amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I've been blessed with good genes, but I think that is a lie, and I would like to see us start to call that out. You know, uh,
Yes.
something that really set me free was when someone once told me that you take a job ad and it's listing all these qualifications that white men will apply for a job if they have 60% of the credentials, right? If they're only 60% qualified, they'll apply and expect to get the job, expect to get the interview and the job.
Wow.
Whereas Black women, we wait until we're like 150% qualified, like we've already done the job or something, which is ridiculous. And so I started applying for things when I'm 60% qualified. and then let people know I'm qualified and I'm really looking forward to growing in this experience and growing in this job and adding these other items to my portfolio. What I've already done shows that I'm capable of learning this other part of the job. So give me the job.
Yes.
So I think it starts with that, with understanding that we are qualified for so much more than we tend to, put our name in the hat for. And then working the job and doing a good job and being content that we've done when we've done enough.
Right.
Not always feel like, well, I don't know if it's enough, so let me do this too and see. And I think if we can just have like just kind of reasonable boundaries, we will be extraordinarily successful, but we will not have killed ourselves, you know?
Right. I appreciate that because when I first started teaching, I'm coming up on my 5th year full time. I would give students thank you notes, like individual students. I would do all this stuff because I was so excited. But then I started getting stressed trying to maintain this mythical image of being, particularly because I look so young, and I would have older students call me out, which now I know how to really set that boundary. But they would say, things like, oh, you look so young. Great, I have great genes. Like, I mean, I'm still your professor. But you're right. This idea that you have to be better than the best, twice as good, and how we perpetuate those things, which is really killing us. I appreciate that. I'm going to use that. I can't wait until this is edited and sent out to the world, because that is going to set a lot of us free to know that we're enough and to be content so that we can sleep at night. Wow.
Yep.
So now we're going to get to what I call the fun part. So I am a student of hip hop and love hip hop. And people typically, like when you meet someone who's into hip hop, they say, who's your top 5 rappers dead or alive? But for our conversation, I would love to know, who are your top 5 Black women writers in no particular order?
Toni Morrison, Alice Walker. Trying to think. Phyllis Wheatley.
Ooh,
she was the first.
right.
That couldn't have been easy. Trying to think. I've been reading a lot of contemporary writers, but their names are kind of not on the tips of my tongue, like the older writers. I would say Rita Dove.
Yes.
And Nikki Giovanni.
Lots of poets.
Yeah.
Poets. That's great. For me, Zora Neale Hurston. I just, I love her work. Nella Larson. I love Harlem Renaissance. Dr. Maya Angelou, of course. And I should have prepared this before. Who? So many.
That kept me grounded and allowed me to finish. And of course, I declared an English major.
I love Lucille Clifton. I think that her work is great. And let me think of someone who's contemporary that I like. Oh my gosh, I haven't even read a lot of contemporary things. I will say, actually, one of my mentors, her name is Dr. Joanne Braxton, and yes, and she does a lot of work with Paul Laurence Dunbar, Dr. Maya Angelou, one of the leading scholars, and she's a poet within her own right. And so, those are my top 5. So I want to thank you for coming on to my podcast. I'm excited for the work that you will continue to do. And I want to know, do you have any parting words before we stop recording?
No, just thank you again so much for having me. This has been good for me to talk about my journey and to kind of reconnect with my own story and need for mentorship. So thank you so much, Tanya. And I can't wait to hear more of what you're doing.
Thank you.